L'kuta Sichos Chelek Tesvav Vayigash Dalid Nishmas Rabbi Yosef Binyamin ben Rabbi Menashe Kaltman. How did Golus Mitzrayim become Golus Mitzrayim? Is there a way that it could have been prevented? And what is the benefit of Golus Mitzrayim? That's what we're going to explore today. In the context of the final pasuk in Parshas Vayigash, that says, Vayeshev Yisrael Beret Mitzrayim, the Yidden, the children of Yankov, lived or settled in the land of Mitzrayim, Be'eretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen, Vayechazu ba, and we'll have to translate that in the course of the Sicha, Vayifru Vayirbu Ma'od. Let's begin. Af die Werte Vayechazu ba in letzten pasuk von unserer Parsha, on the words Vayechazu ba, which is in the last pasuk of the Parsha, which says, Vayeshev Yisrael Beretz Mitzrayim, Yidden settled in Mitzrayim, or Yisrael settled in Mitzrayim, Be'eretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen, Vayechazu ba. Let's just say for now, they acquired it, they took possession of it, Vayifru Vayirbu Ma'od, and they were fruitful and they multiplied greatly. That's the last pasuk. So Rashi, in the words Vayechazu ba, there are two explanations. Aleph, der Pirush from Vayechazu, latent pshat from pasuk. The explanation as it would be according to the pshat, to the basic understanding of the pasuk. V'Rashi taicht loshen achuza, and as Rashi says that the word vayechazu comes from the word achuza, which means an estate or an acquired possession. They took possession of it, they owned it, they lived there. Base, that's the pashat pshat, and that's what Rashi says. They settled in Mitzrayim and Eretz Goshen vayechazu ba. And they owned it. They lived there. Base. There are Pirush from Medrash. Then there's a Pirush of the Medrash, which says as follows: Haaretz hoisa oicheses bohem v'toifeses bohem. The land took hold of them and held them in its grasp. Ka'adam shebal karchei achuz ba, like a person that is being held against his will. Das heißt, as vayechazu is from lashon achiza halten, which means in the first pshat, vayechazu is from the word achuza, which means ownership. And the second vayechazu is from the word achiza, which means a hold. Now, before we ask the question that the Rebbe often asks, how do you reconcile two seemingly opposite explanations in the same pasuk? We first have to understand the pshat. Why does the pshat here go with achuza, ownership, and not with achiza, holding? Now, so that's what you say in the brackets. Der hechrich in pshat to der shlila from pirush lashon achuza. The reason why, according to pshat, we cannot say that it means holding is as follows. Von hemshech pasuk vayeshev gomer vayechazu ba vayifru gomer. If you follow the context of the pasuk, they settled there. Vayechazu vayifru. They were fruitful. They grew. Is mashmaz mit die Wörter Vayechazu ba meint die Teure zu unterstreichen dem Öfen von sehr besetzen sich in Eretz Goshen. It seems to imply that the Torah is trying to underscore the manner in which they settled in Eretz Goshen, the land of Goshen, as it is given azah was hat gebracht zu vayifru vayirbu ma'od. It was the type of settling that brought to this prospering and to this growth. Kemenit al derech hapshat lernen kipirush hamedrash. So if we're following this pshat, we can't follow the medrash, learn like the medrash. As it is, Yashvus is given in an oifen from Balkarche that they settled there against their will. If you're forced to be somewhere, it doesn't lead to growth, not financial growth, and nor biological growth. Nor can you say that vayechazu means from the word achiza to take hold. As Eden haben hier ihr gehalten durch ihr Besetzen, that the Yidden took hold of the land, meaning to say, the first pshat is achuza, ownership. The second pshat is achiza, which means to hold. Now we can say that the land took hold of them, because that would seem that it's against their will, and that would not seem to flow with the context of the pasuk. So maybe vayechazu means to hold, that the Yidden took hold of the land. So that doesn't either work. Valdan hat gedart stehen vayochazu. Der Aleph mit a choilem ba. Und nicht vayechazu ba. Aleph mitakamatz as they seien durch ihr gehalten geworden. Because in Hebrew grammar, to say they took hold of it, you would say vayochazu, they held onto it, bought into it. If it says vayeochazu, that means they were held by it. And since that's what the pasuk says, we can't translate that it means that they held onto it, they took hold of it. So therefore, we cannot translate it lashon achiza, and therefore the pshat has to be lashon achuza. Okay. So now let's try to figure out how to fuse together, how to reconcile these two seemingly paradoxical explanations in the pasuk. So if you will get as it's designed to merit the perushim for Nazal of demselben Wort or the Inyan, it's been discussed many times that when there are several explanations on one word or one idea, this does not mean that they are totally different one from another. Quite the contrary, because they are explanations of the same word. Therefore, we must conclude that there is somewhat of a connection between them. But these two above mentioned explanations, one that they lived there and they took ownership of the land, or that the land took ownership of them or took hold of them, are not only not connected to each other, they are opposite implications. Leiten Schat von Pasuk seinen die Wörter wie Achus und Madgish as dies Yashos von Israel in Eretz Goshen is given an Nefen was is given Zeir Land Zeir Nachuza. If you say the first pshat, according to the pshat of the pasuk, the simple meaning of the pasuk, which is what Rashi brings, it underscores the fact that the settling of the Yidden in Eretz Goshen was in a way that it became their land, their estate. According to the Pirush of the Medrash, the implication is that just the opposite, that they were taken hold, that they were taken by the land against their will. Certainly doesn't mean they prospered there. Certainly doesn't mean that they took ownership of it if the land owns them or the land has a hold on them. So they seem to be opposite explanations. So how are we going to reconcile these two? So in order to do this, we are going to put this Rashi on the side for quite some time, and we're going to now delve into the Rashi before this one. In the beginning of this very same pasuk, the last pasuk of Parshas Vayigash. That is very moving noch in Mevaris and dem friedigen Dibur from Pirush Rashi, af in haschalas hakasuv, was is a hagdama zu vayachazu ba. We'll understand this by first exploring the previous Rashi, which is on the beginning of the pasuk and serves as a preface to vayachazu ba. Where Rashi quotes the words, and Yisrael settled in the land of Mitzrayim, and his Mefarash and Rashi explains as follows. Now keep in mind that the pasuk says, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen. So Rashi quotes the words, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, and explains, we're in Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen, shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim, which is part of Mitzrayim. Now, Mefarshim Zag, and the Mefarshim explain, as Rashi kum davaran in the Shaila, Rashi came to address the following issue. V'loshen be'eretz Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen, as mashmaz is an tzvei bazun derarotzes. You say in the land of Mitzrayim, in the land of Goshen, implies that there's two separate lands. One land is called Goshen, one land is called Mitzrayim. And then you're going to wonder, which one did they dwell in? The Rebbe Zakt Rashi, and therefore Rashi explains, V'heichan be'eretz Goshen, says Ki'ilu v'in pasuk shteit be'eretz Mitzrayim, V'heichan be'eretz Goshen. It's as if the pasuk would have said, they settled in Mitzrayim, we're in Mitzrayim, in the land of Goshen. So that's how Mefarshim explain what Rashi is coming to teach us. That Rashi is bothered by the double be'eretz. Therefore Rashi explains that Eretz Goshen is inside of Mitzrayim. Says aber nit move on. However, this raises three questions. Aleph, why does Rashi have to add the words that shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim, that it is in Mitzrayim? Das versteht man doch von dem Hemshich. Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, v'heichan be'eretz Goshen. If Rashi hadn't said those last three words, would have just said the Dibur HaMaschil and Yisrael settled in Mitzrayim, v'heichon, and where, be'eretz Goshen, you would understand that Eretz Goshen is in Mitzrayim. Why does Rashi have to add the words, which is in Mitzrayim? Base. Al derech zeh kemefregen in pasuk gufa. The same question could be asked on the words of the pasuk. So was after pasuk sagen be'eretz Mitzrayim und danach usteitchen be'eretz Goshen. Why does the pasuk have to specify that it was in Mitzrayim and then explain that within Mitzrayim it was in Goshen? As it's genug be'eretz Goshen, it would have sufficed had it said be'eretz Goshen. Umeveshoin ados is in eretz Mitzrayim, and we already know that Goshen is in Mitzrayim. Vival steht früher in der Parsha befeirush as Eretz Goshen is atil von Eretz Mitzrayim. It already in this Parsha, Parshas Vayigash, earlier on, it says that Eretz Goshen is a part of Mitzrayim. Earlier on in Pasuk Perek Mem Zayin Pasuk Vav, Paroi says to Yosef that you should have your brothers and your father dwell in the best parts of Eretz, Meitav ha'oretz, in the best part of the land, be'eretz Goshen. A little bit later it says, be'meitav ha'oretz be'eretz Ramses, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses. And Rashi over there says in Pasuk Yud Aleph that Ramses is in Goshen. So already both of these psukim, Pasuk Vav and Pasuk Yud Aleph of Perek Mem Zayin, already implied to us that Goshen is in Mitzrayim. So had the Pasuk over here said, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Goshen, we would have known that they were in Mitzrayim, because we know that Goshen is in Mitzrayim. So why does the Pasuk have to say be'eretz Mitzrayim? That was question 2. Question 3. If Rashi is coming to explain the arichas haloshen, the long-windedness of the pasuk, be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen. According to this, the only thing that's bothering Rashi is why did it say be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen? And Rashi answers, it was in Mitzrayim, and where in Mitzrayim in Goshen. But if that was the only thing that was bothering Rashi, was is meitik von pasuk eich di verta vayeshev Yisrael? Why does Rashi quote from the pasuk the words and Yisrael settled? In other words, we know from many of the sichos that we've learned that the Dibur HaMaschil is actually a glimpse into either what's bothering Rashi or what Rashi is coming to tell us. So if Rashi was only coming to explain be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen, then Rashi should have said be'eretz Mitzrayim v'heicham be'eretz Goshen. There seems to be no need to add the words Vayeshev Yisrael, unless Vayeshev Yisrael is part of something Rashi is coming to tell us, and therefore it's part of the Dibur HaMaschil. And the question is, what is that? What is Rashi coming to tell us with the words Vayeshev Yisrael? So in Ziv Gimel, the Rebbe is going to explain that Rashi is not bothered by the words Be'eretz Mitzrayim, Be'eretz Goshen. That's not what is bothering Rashi. Rashi is bothered by something else, and that will be answered with what Rashi comes to tell us. They're bigger than them. Rashi is the uisen zu bewahren in the stide von tegen a pasuk von a friedliche parsha. Rashi is addressing a contradiction between this pasuk and something that we learned in a previous parsha. By Bris Ben Abesarim, the Eibishter gesagt zu Avram, by the Bris Ben Abesarim, the covenant between the pieces, in which Hashem promises Eretz Yisrael to Avram Avinu for his children, for his offspring. So the Eibishter says, God Almighty says, Ki ger yi yezaracha be'eretz leilahem, your children will be strangers, aliens, in a land that is not theirs. The achar chen yetzu, and then they will go out with great wealth, the gomer, etc., and then they will go to Eretz Yisrael. Das heißt, as Eder die Bnei Yisrael will gain in Eretz Yisrael, before the Yidden will ultimately go to the land of Eretz Yisrael, wollen sie müssen früher abkommen Golus. Durch sein Ager be'eretz leilahem. First they have to experience an exile by being an alien in a land that is not theirs. And then they can go to Eretz Yisrael. Now here comes the question. Aber wie ist shaykh zu sagen, als Bnei Yisrael sind in dem Golus abgekommen? Mit sehr gefinnen sich in Mitzrayim. How can you say that the Yidden experience this type of Golus by being in Mitzrayim? Beis mir zendo im Pasuk, als jemand sich dorten besetzt. If this pasuk tells us that they settled there. Vayeshev from Lashon Toishav. Vayeshev from the word Toishav, which means someone, a dweller, a citizen. Heipich von Ger, which is the opposite of a stranger, of an alien. Under Tzunach, not only were they settled there in Eretz Goshen. Was is given the estate free in the pasuk Meitav ha'aretz. They were settling in Goshen, which was the best of the land of Mitzrayim. And in what manner were they living there? As if they took ownership of it. Since it became their estate. It became their property. So how can you fulfill being a ger, be'eretz leilahem, being a stranger in a land that isn't theirs, if they're living, dwelling, settling in this high real estate, high value part of Mitzrayim, and living there as if it's their own? And this is why already the answer to question Gimel, why Rashi quotes the words Vayeshev Yisrael in the Dibur HaMaschil in the beginning of the Rashi. Weil die Schwierigkeit in Pasuk ist, wie gesagt, in dem Eufen von Yisrael's Vayeshev in Eretz Goshen. It's the Vayeshev, it's the settling that's bothering Rashi. If it says V'hoyu sham, or whatever else, whatever other word they could have used, okay, they were there temporarily, and they were trying to get out. But as soon as it says Vayeshev Yisrael, they settled there. All of a sudden, Rashi says, 1 second. How does this klep? How does this fit with what we learned in Parshas Lech Lecha, that it has to be be'eretz leilahem? Die kashle bewahren der Pasuk, was es mevor in Pirush Rashi. Durch Moshe sein die Werte be'eretz Mitzrayim, she'im eretz Mitzrayim. And this is what the Pasuk is answering. As Rashi explains it, where the Pasuk adds the words be'eretz Mitzrayim, and Rashi adds the words shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim, which was question Aleph and question Beis. And Rashi is answering this question. Sof is eich Eretz Goshen achelik von Eretz Mitzrayim. At the end of the day, Eretz Goshen, the land of Goshen, is still a part of Mitzrayim. Und nicht Eretz Canaan, and it's not a part of the land of Canaan. Und derfar wird sehr besetzen sich in Eretz Goshen verrechnet als Golus. And therefore settling in Eretz Goshen is still considered to be in Golus. Weil mit dem Gufa, was sie gefinden sich nicht in Eretz Canaan, because the very fact that they are not in the land of Canaan, Zeir Eretz, which is their land, seinen sie a ger kemer be'eretz leilahem, they de facto are a ger, an alien in a land that isn't theirs. Which means it's not so much about how they live, it's about where they are. Their land is Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan. If they're not in Eretz Canaan, that is considered Eretz leilahem. So that is a Rashi. That is the explanation of this first Rashi in the pasuk. Rashi is coming to tell us that the Yidden were settling in Eretz Goshen. In Eretz Mitzrayim. We're in Mitzrayim in Eretz Goshen, but Rashi reminds us that Goshen is, as the pasuk says, in Mitzrayim, so it wasn't Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it's still in Eretz Leilahem. However, this does not fully satisfy the issue. In Seif Daled, the Rebbe is going to ask 2 questions. One, on the concept of Galus, that where do you see the Galus in this? And number 2, the Rebbe is going to point out that it's still not really Eretz Leilahem, it's still not really not their land if they own it and they live there. Let's see how the Rebbe takes us through these 2 steps. Dalit, aber noch als nicht glattig, it's still not entirely satisfactory, at least on a deeper level. Since Yodua, as die Kavana von Golus Mitzrayim ist gewesen, als Eden sollen dort ausgeleitet werden, und sein Roi zu Kabbalas HaTeire, und hereinkommen danach in Eretz Yisrael. The Alter Rebbe explains in Torah that the purpose of Golus Mitzrayim was to refine the Yidden. It's like the Torah calls it a Kura Barzel, the furnace that is so hot that it separates the other metals, the cheaper metals, from the silver, and it produces, it purifies the silver. Similarly, the Yidden had to go through a slavery, through a difficult time to refine them and bring them to a level of purity that would make them ready to receive the Torah and to go into Eretz Yisrael. Heint. Wie hat sich fort ausgeführt, die Kavana, die Leiterung von Galus und Shibud Mitzrayim durch Dominion von Vayeshev Yisrael v'Gomer. If the Yidden are living comfortably in a land that is theirs, in the best part of Eretz Mitzrayim, how does this bring about, how does this implement this refinement if they're not going through a difficult time? The concept of the refinement is you have to get beaten, or you have to go through a hot furnace, something that is very difficult in order to be able to bring out the best in you. But if they're living it up and they're enjoying life, how does that produce an Ausleiterung, a refinement for the Yidden? That's our first question. In other words, they didn't go there just to have fun. They went for a purpose. The purpose is the refinement of the Jewish people. How does living in Goshen in this type of way create a refinement of the Yidden? Die Kasche wird noch stärker. Leut wieder Inyan von Vayigash Zuba wird mevur in Chelek Adrashe B'Teira. And this question becomes stronger as we will explain the idea of Vayigash Zuba in the area of Drash in Teira Ubahaktim. And let us first discuss this. Let's analyze what does the Drash say about Vayigash Zuba. In other words, the pshat of Vayigash Zuba, as we said, means they settled there. They took ownership of it. But the Drash is going to take it a little bit deeper. Von dem was steht in Pasuk Vayigash Zuba Lashon Achuza, because to say that they acquired it doesn't say Vayiknu Isa or something else that would mean they took ownership of it. It says Achuza darf uskommen as Eretz Goshen is given Memela geblieben an Achuza v'Yerusha b'Yidden. It implies that this is something that was a heritage, a Yerusha, an inheritance, something that they owned permanently, and something that they inherited, if not permanently forever, but permanently for a significant amount of time. And a Yerusha, Achuza, has various translations. One of them is an inheritance. So the fact that the pasuk uses the word Vayigash Zuba, and Rashi says Lashon Achuza, which is the pshat of Vayigash Zuba, there is some implication over here that this was more than just a place that they were passing through. They owned it and they inherited it. Is nit muvan. Was lacheri das in ganzen muvan seemingly not understood. Wie is shaykh to sagen auf a chelek von Eretz Mitzrayim, das is an achuza v'Yerusha l'vnei Yisrael? How can a portion of the land of Mitzrayim be considered the ownership and the inheritance of the Yidden? Eretz Canaan is a Yerusha for Yidden v'yeshteit lo saslacha es aretz es l'rishta. The land of Canaan was said to Avram Avinu that this is going to be you're going to be given this land to inherit it. Aber nicht Eretz Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is not a Yerusha. How can you refer to Goshen as a Yerusha of the Yidden? In derech pshat as a king kashen it in the area of pshat. It's not a question. Rabbi das besetzen sich in Eretz Goshen hat sich gezeugen die ganze Zeit von Golus Mitzrayim redushana, since the dwelling in Goshen endured the entire time that the Yidden were in Mitzrayim, which was 210 years. Is masim in pasos of them the lashon achuza. So on a basic level, you could use the word achuza. It means they lived there for a very long time. If a family buys an estate and live on the estate, the children and the children's children for over 200 years, you could say this is this family's estate, even though they bought it from someone and later it gets moved on to someone else. But if you're following drash, versus not which drash looks more at the inner picture, at the deeper understanding of this, is fartnit glatik. So it's not understood. In reality, this wasn't theirs. They were living there for a while, but it wasn't really theirs. So how could you say Vayigash Zuba that they took ownership of it, they inherited it, if it wasn't really theirs? So one answer we'll find in the Radak. The Radak in Sefer Yeshua bringt b'shem Adrash, das was es steht dort, as Yeshua hat eingenommen es kol Eretz HaGoshen. The Radak says, there's a pasuk over there, Vayigash Yeshua in Sefer Yeshua. Vayigash Yeshua es kol Eretz HaZois, es kol HaNegev, es kol Eretz HaGoshen. Yeshua took the land and the south and the land of Goshen. Says the Radak, this is referring to Yeshua conquered Goshen that was in Mitzrayim. And it was absorbed with all of the other cities of Eretz Yisrael. And a few prakim later, when the pasuk lists the various different cities that became the inheritance, the ownership of the tribe of Yehuda, Goshen is included, because even though Goshen was in Mitzrayim, but Goshen became part in this context, Goshen became part of Eretz Yisrael. So according to this, in the realm of Drash, we can explain Vayigash ba. Ados said it's Goshen is given on Yerusha by Eden. The fact that the pasuk over here in Parshas Vayigash says that Goshen became a Yerusha, an inheritance of the Eden. It does their farvas. He is nivle given on B'seichar Yisrael is Malvin Yeshua. Is because ultimately, eventually, in the time of Yeshua, the land of Goshen became absorbed into the cities of Eretz Yisrael. So that's a suggested explanation. That Vayigash ba means they inherited it. When did they inherit it? In the time of Yeshua. But this is difficult to learn. As in the Zeit von dem Pasuk Vayeshev Yisrael, so schon ot dies Yasvos and Eretz Goshen angerufen werden mit Namen Achuzo, because how can you say that in the time of this pasuk Vayeshev Yisrael, so this settling in the land of Goshen should already be called Achuzah, der Farvas mit hunderte Jahren später, but Eretz Goshen nivle werden durch Kibbutz Yeshua zwischen die Ara Yisrael, because centuries later, in the time of Yeshua, Eretz Goshen will become absorbed with the other cities of Eretz Yisrael. You're talking now so many years earlier. You're saying the Yidden settled Vayigash ba, and they inherited it. When? A bunch of centuries later. It doesn't fit. Is there beer in them? So the Rebbe is going to give a different explanation instead. We're still focused on the word Vayigash ba as a Yerusha. That when you say Vayigash ba, it means they inherited it. How could it be they inherited it if it wasn't really theirs? So there is an explanation for this as follows. As steht in Medrash, the Medrash says, Medrash Tatshe, I think. No, Medrash Tatshe was something else. Pirkei de Rebbe Lazar. Es steht in Medrash as Paroi hat Soren gegeben Eretz Goshen la'Achuzah. That it says that Paroi, after Paroi abducted Sarah and then released her, he gave her the land of Goshen as an inheritance. And therefore the Yidden are going to dwell in the land of Goshen, or Yashvu, they dwelled in Goshen. Shehi shall Sarah imenu, because it belonged to Sarah, it belonged to their mother, their grandmother. As Eden haben bekommen Eretz Goshen bi Yerusha von Sarah. Which means to imply that Yidden received the land of Goshen as an inheritance from Sarah, and therefore to say the words Vayigash ba, that they inherited it, makes perfect sense, because they did inherit it from Sarah, their grandmother. Their meat wird aber noch stärker die Kasche, but this, on the other hand, this intensifies our question. Wie seien in es b'nei Yisrael abgekommen dem Golus Mitzrayim? Durch sehr gefinnen sich in Eretz Goshen. How can the Yidden experience the concept of Golus? By being in the land of Goshen, which has Goshen hat gehört zu sie, als Yerusha Goshen belonged to them as an inheritance. Und sie seien in Remelen nicht gewähnt, ger be'eretz leilahem. They were not in a land that is not theirs. They were in their land. So how can you say that's ger be'eretz leilahem? Which is a necessary requirement to fulfill the prophecy to Avraham Avinu and to be able to make the Yidden prepared to go out of Mitzrayim and to receive the Torah and to go into Eretz Yisrael. So this leaves us with two questions. First question is, the whole purpose of Golus was to refine the Yidden, and if they're living it up and enjoying life in the land of Goshen, how does the refinement happen? And question number two, they have to be be'eretz leilahem, and it's true that it's not Eretz Canaan, and therefore it's Eretz leilahem to a certain degree, but it is their land. They received it from Sarah, be'Yerusha, and therefore it's theirs. So how can you say be'eretz? How can this be a fulfillment of the prophecy be'eretz leilahem? So in Sifei, the Rebbe is going to take us onto a deeper understanding of what Golus really is, and when we understand what Golus really is, we'll understand that the Yidden still experienced Golus despite the fact that Eretz Yisrael, that life wasn't difficult for them, relatively speaking, and despite the fact that they received Eretz Goshen as a Yerusha. Wenn wir das verstehen mit dem, was es ist mevur in Teire as die alle Protei Aveda von Golus Mitzrayim, Bevei Kasha, Bechemer, Bolvenim, the Teire says that all of the various elements of the slavery in Mitzrayim, as the pasuk says, Vayigash in hard work, b'chaymer the preparing the cement, u'b'leveinim preparing the bricks, v'gaymer zenefaran oichen ruchnis dikin zin in esek haTorah, also exist on a spiritual level in the study of Torah. V'yishtet in Zohar, as the Zohar says, ba'Vayigash zu kushya. The word kasha, which means hard work, also is similar to the word kushya, which means question. This refers to questioning and when learning Torah, to question what you're learning and to answer those questions and to delve deeper into learning Torah. B'chaymer, do kal v'chaymer. Chaymer, which means the material, or it means the cement. Also, the word chaymer means severity. So it refers to the mechanics of learning Torah and figuring out and understanding various different things through different ways, one of which is kal v'chaymer, which is to learning something more severe from something more lenient, or vice versa, called kal v'chaymer. U'bileveinim, and the word leveinim is similar to the word libun ilchas halacha, to clarify. Libun literally means to whiten, which means to make clear what the halacha is. Which, so this is the process. First you have to question, then you have to respond with various different ways, with a kal v'chaymer, for example, and ultimately you get to the conclusion, libun ilchasa, to clarify what the halacha is. So these various different elements of the slavery also exist in the process of learning Torah. And when a Yid engages and toils in this difficult work, of learning Torah, he experiences this hard work for Golos Mitzrayim when a daftar satam begashmis, and he doesn't have to actually do it in a physical, literal sense. That's what the Alter Rebbe says in Torah. That either a person experiences Golos in the literal sense, where they're actually making bricks and cement and building walls and everything else the Yidden had to do in Mitzrayim, or a person can have the same experience on a spiritual level and fulfill their obligation on that level. As the Mishnah says, whoever accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah, was the diuk in them is oil Torah, and is of sich mekabel dem yoch, the aveda kashach chulu hanal bezoyar von Torah. And Mishnah says the word oil Torah, he accepts upon himself the yoke of Torah, symbolizing the hard work, the difficult toil of studying Torah, as expressed in the above mentioned Zohar, is mavirim menu emachas vel derech eretz. We remove from him the yoke of the government and the yoke of society. In other words, if a person has to experience the difficulties of learning Torah, we take away from him. He shouldn't have to experience the difficulties that are imposed by a foreign government or that are imposed by a society. So we see the same concept, that if a person experiences the hardship of Torah, we take away other hardships from them. This can answer the question about where was the hardship of the Golos Mitzrayim if they were living in Goshen. Seien die Bnei Yisrael abgekommen und aufgetan in die Jahre von dem Golos Vashiva Mitzrayim, even in Eretz Goshen, the Yidden experienced a form of Golos, and they accomplished what had to be done through the slavery and the exile of Mitzrayim, by studying Torah, by toiling in Torah, in dem Beis HaTalmud, in the study hall. Which was established by Yankov and his children, as we know, the famous Sichen brought in Hayom Yom, that was Yehuda Shalach al Yosef Leiros Lefan of Goshen, and Yaakov sent Yehuda ahead to build a yeshiva, to open up a yeshiva in the land of Goshen, so that there should be a place of learning. So when they arrived, Yaakov and his sons would learn in yeshiva, not just learn, but they would toil in learning, and therefore that was the avodah kasha that they experienced, and therefore they didn't have to work hard. They didn't have to experience slavery, because they were experiencing the hardships of learning Torah. And this answers the first question that we asked in the beginning of Sif Dalid: where was the uisleiterung? Where was the refinement if there wasn't labor, hard work? The answer is the labor of Torah. Und das ist euch der Remez al derech jene shel Torah bebiur von Pirush Rashi vayeachazu. And this will also fit with the words vayeachazu, which Rashi says lashon achuza. Now, literally, lashon achuza means that they owned it as an estate, or they inherited it. But in the Yeno Shel Torah, the word Vayigash will fit with what we're saying over here, that they were learning Torah as follows. Der Golus Mitzrayim means ein erste Tkufa, in the first period of Golus Mitzrayim, which is the period until Yosef and his brothers die. When the Yidden haben sich dort besetzt, so when the Yidden settled in Eretz Goshen, is nicht given verbunden mit Aved Kasha v'chulu begashmius. It was not connected with literally physical labor. Adrabe demelt is es given an Eifen, was sich angehört, as das is Meitav Haaretz. At the time, they experienced it as the best part of Mitzrayim. As they are in dort in Zeir Achuz, and then they are in their own estate. Allah ben gewusst und anerkennt, dass Yidden gefinden sich in Zeir and eigen Land. Everyone knew and recognized that the Yidden were in their own land, wo sie finden sich wie sie willen, and where they conduct themselves as they wish. Nicht zayendik unterworfen dem Shibud Mitzrayim, not being bound to the slavery of Mitzrayim. Und der Shibud HaGolus hat sich ausgedrückt place in der Rabbi von Torah. And the slavery of Golus was expressed solely by the toil of Torah. So when Rashi says Vayigash, they were dwelling there, they were living it up. Rashi is implying in Yeno Shel Torah that the Gashmis, they were living it up well, and the Golus expressed itself in the toil of Torah. And with this, we've answered our first question. Where was the hardship, and therefore the Uisleiterung, the refinement that comes through the hardship of Golus? The answer is, it was in their learning Torah. In Sivav, we're going to answer the second question. How can you call it Be'eretz Lo Lohem if they owned it, if they received it B'Yerusha from Sarah? As far as the Chaber Nach Bir, it's still, we still require an explanation. Wie bald Saf haben die in Gejarschen leiten Pirish am Eidrish Eretz Geisha von Sarah. Hein wie can es fortverrechen werden als Golos Be'eretz Lo Lohem if they inherited this land from Sarah? How can you consider it a land that is not theirs? Is there beard in them? And even though they owned it, it belonged to them as an inheritance from Sarah. Doch hat sie nicht vermocht in sich die Darges HaKdusha. It still didn't have the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Asher Gemer Eine Hashem Lekecha, the land that the Eibusher's eyes are upon it. When in them is bestanden the Golus Be'eretz Lo Lohem, and this is what the Lo Lohem, the fact that it's not their land, consists of. As they dwelled, as they settled in the land of Goshen, even in the first period, which is when they were living well. The Yidden were pained by the fact that they weren't in the land that the Eibusher's eyes are upon it. And therefore it's considered a land that isn't theirs. It wasn't of the status, of the stature, and it wasn't of the holiness that was worthy of their being. And with this pain, the fact that they were pained by the fact that they were in a land that, though it belonged to them, wasn't really where they belonged. It wasn't really where the holiness was. It wasn't really where the Eibusher's eyes are. This bothered them, and with this pain was part of the Golus. So really, we now have a full understanding of the first Rashi on this pasuk. Rashi is telling us that despite the fact that the Eibusher said, or rather because the Eibusher said that the Yidden are going to be in Golus, Be'eretz Lo Lohem, so despite the fact that the Yidden lived in Eretz Goshen, and materially speaking, they were living comfortably, nevertheless, number one, they learned Torah, and they worked hard in learning Torah, and so they experienced the Golus. Number two, it was, despite the fact that they owned the land, but they knew that it wasn't really where they belonged, and therefore they were pained by it. So first of all, it was Eretz Lo Lohem, maybe not on paper, but in the fact that it didn't have the holiness that they were worthy of, and together with that, they felt pain that they weren't where they should be, and that was part of the Golus that they were experiencing. So the question now is, what happened after that? How did the Yidden end up in real slavery? And this is almost painful to learn and to understand. Aber Agamas, der Anheb von der Sif sein. Aber Agamas, der Anheb von der Golus is in Mitzrayim is given in Anheb von Vayigash Canal. Even though the Golus began in this manner of Vayigash, as we explained earlier, that they were living there, they were owning it, they were living comfortably. It was still a step down from where they compared to where they came from. They lived in Eretz Canaan, and when they were there, they were on a higher level, and they had to come down to Mitzrayim. Und das hat gegeben an Ort, dass sie sollen später darfen durchgehen dem Golus Mitzrayim Kibsutei. And because ultimately they had stepped down, this opened the door that ultimately they're going to have to experience the painful and literal slavery in Mitzrayim. Das heißt, and how did it play itself out? As noch dem Siyum von der erste Tkufe, when this first period ended, in Mizman ben Vayamas Yosef v'chalacha v'chaladerahu, when Yosef and all of his brothers passed away, and all the members of that generation, was to leave them at Ongeben fell in the Igia Bateirin and Beis Talmud Shal Yankiv Ubanov, and this is when the learning Torah in the study hall of Yankiv and his children began to diminish. Und es hat sich angeben, vergessen dem Zar von dem Sein be'eretz leilahem, and they began to forget the pain of being in a land where they didn't belong. Hat sich dann angefangen in der Shibud Mitzrayim Kibsutei. This triggered the literal slavery in Mitzrayim. Bis es hat sich ausgesehen, kilu oisa yem nichtus on Mitzrayim, until it got so bad that every day seemed as if it was their first day there. Usually, after a while, a person gets used to it and it gets easier. But here the slavery was so difficult that every day felt like the first day. But genommen vergessen, dass das Land gehört zu Eden, they began to forget that the land belongs to the Yidden, und angeheben fielen die Bitterkeit von Meitzer Galus, and they began to feel the bitterness and the pain of Galus. Und das ist Rashi uisen zu Madgesam bepirushay. And this is what Rashi is here in the first Rashi of Vayeshev Yisrael. This is what Rashi wants to tell us. Vayeshev Yisrael beretz Mitzrayim. Yidden settled in the land of Mitzrayim. Vehechon, where in Mitzrayim? Beretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen. Shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim. It is part of Mitzrayim. In Ornei bis der Golos Mitzrayim taka gewen vehechon. In a nation von Eretz Goshen, Meitav Aretz. In the beginning, it was Vehechon. Where was it? It was in Goshen. It was in the best of the land. The Yidden had a fine experience. It wasn't so terrible. But then, Shehi Me'eretz Mitzrayim, but then the second part came. Aber le'idach darfon wissen Shehi Me'eretz Mitzrayim, even then they had to know that it's Mitzrayim. Das Gufe was Yidden haben sich gedarf versetzen in Eretz Goshen, meint schon Yirid in Eretz Mitzrayim. The fact that they had to be in the land of Goshen means that they had descended into the land of Mitzrayim. Und noch mehr, but more than that, Eretz Goshen allein is verwandelt geworden in dem echten Golos Mitzrayim, Shehi Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Eretz Goshen itself evolved into being the worst Galus Mitzrayim. Shasmat nit uzginitz the Meitav Aretz von Eretz Goshen Avedis Hashem. If they did not utilize this good land that they had to serve Hashem, the Adrabah, their Vayishman hat geführt zum Vayivat. This is a reference to the pasuk Vayishman Yeshurim Vayivat, which is in Parshas Ha'azinu. Vayishman means they became fat. It's a euphemism for became filled with materialism. So the Vayishman, the fact that they were so immersed in materialism, this led to Vayivat, that they rebelled against Hashem. Is in Eretz Goshen Gufa, wo Eden haben gelebt, b'chol meshech zman ha'Galus Kanal, geworden the Shivim Mitzrayim Kibsutei. In the land of Goshen, where the Yidden were living throughout the entire duration of Galus, the 210 years, that's where the Shivim Mitzrayim happened. It happened in Goshen. So Rashi is telling us that you have to know that Goshen is really Mitzrayim. Even when they were there, they had to realize that it was Eretz Mitzrayim, because they had to realize that it wasn't where they belonged. And when they didn't realize it well enough, it actually became Mitzrayim. It became the worst of Galus Mitzrayim. And the Rebbe adds over here another nekuda, which hadn't really been brought up yet previously in the Sikha, that it was actually getting immersed in the Meitav Ha'aretz that distracted them and caused them to vayivat, caused them to rebel against Hashem, and to ultimately end up in a literal galus. Now, earlier on, the second paragraph of Sifhei, when we explained that the galus was experienced through the difficulty of Torah, the Rebbe explained Vayachazu in Yena Shal Torah that it means that the galus did not affect how they lived begashmius. Also here in Sif Ches, the Rebbe explains Vayiachazu. Now that we understand that the Yidden ended up in Golus Mitzrayim, and it was an actual, literal Golus and a physical, menial labor that they had to experience. Here too, we'll see a connection with Vayiachazu in Yena Shal Torah, the way Vayiachazu is understood from the Hasidic perspective. When you say Vayiachazu, before we looked at Vayiachazu in the Yena Shal Torah as Lashon Achuza, ownership. Now we're going to look at Vayiachazu Lashon Yerusha and how B'Yena Shal Torah it connects with Galus Kipshutei. When you say that Vayiachazu means Lashon Yerusha, which is how we explained it in the beginning of Seif Dalet, this will fit well with the inner dimension of what is Galus Mitzrayim. Additionally, von dem is verstandig as Gott der Pshat muss nicht the Lashon Achuza enthalten dem Teichen von Yerusha. As it not that even though according to the way of Pshat, it is not necessary to say that Achuza means Yerusha. Is aber Rashi Merames mit die Werte Lashon Achuza auf Teichen von Yerusha. But nevertheless, Rashi is alluding to the meaning of Yerusha in Yena Shal Torah versus Far Behalten and Pirush Rashi in the deeper part understanding of Torah, which is concealed, which is hidden inside of Rashi. In other words, first of all, Vayiachazu Lashon Yerusha is going to help us understand and connect to concept of Galus, and because of that, we understand that when Rashi says Lashon Achuza, even though literally it does not have to mean Yerusha, but in Yena Shal Torah it does mean Yerusha. The beer in them. Die Kavane von Golus Mitzrayim is gewesen, als Eden soll mevarer sein und mitnehmen mit sich die Dusche, was gefunden sich Mitzrayim. In addition to the fact that we said earlier that going through Mitzrayim was meant to refine the Yidden themselves, to prepare them for receiving the Torah and going into Eretz Yisrael, there's another aspect, and that is that Golus Mitzrayim was there so the Yidden should refine and elevate and take along the sparks of holiness that were in Mitzrayim. Und das ist der Teichen Pnimi von Vayinatzlu es Mitzrayim, which is the deeper meaning of the fact that the Yidden emptied out Mitzrayim. Was die Chazal teitchen kasa'ua ki mitzuda shein badagon. They turned Mitzrayim into a silo that has no grain. Ki mitzuda shein badagim, like a pond, like a body of water that have no fish. They totally emptied it out, as the Yidden of Mevarer Umaylik when the Tzutze HaKdusha von Elam HaToyu, the Yidden refined and elevated the sparks of holiness that had fallen from the world of Toyu, which fell in Mitzrayim, and the Yidden removed every last spark of holiness from Mitzrayim. Und das ist Rashi Merames mit Vayiachas Balashon Achuza. And it is to this concept, the concept of taking along these sparks that Rashi is alluding to when he says Vayachazuba, that it means Lashon Achuza. The Kavanu and Tachas and Vayeshav Yisrael Beretz Mitzrayim, Golus Mitzrayim. The whole purpose of the Yidden settling in Mitzrayim, which was the Golus in Mitzrayim, is given as Yidden sollen dort durch dem Jöre sein, die Nitzetzes von Eretz Yisrael, was for the purpose of the Yidden should inherit, take ownership, and take along these sparks of the world of Toyu. And therefore, Vayachazuba, they inherited the land, referring to, they inherited the sparks of holiness that were in the land of Mitzrayim. As we know that the Maimer of the Frierdiker Rebbe, as Sidrei HaYerusha B'Umus Olam is al derech tichsiv, that the way it works in inheritance by the nations is ubein ein loy. If the person does not have a son, unesatim es nachlosei la'achiv, then the inheritance goes to the brother. Since Esav is Yaakov's brother, so in Chassidus it's explained that Yaakov comes from Tikkun and Esav comes from Toyu. But since Esav is Yaakov's brother, so Yaakov, then the Eden Yedis to Toyu. So Yaakov, or the children of Yaakov, the Yidden, they inherit the lights of the world of Toyu because Yaakov is the brother of Esav. So therefore, that's the connection of Vayachazu Balashon Yerusha to the Golus Mitzrayim, because the purpose of Golus Mitzrayim was for the purpose of Yerusha to inherit the sparks. So what we've done up until here is we understand very, very well the first Rashi that Vayeshev Yisrael Be'eretz Goshen, that Yidden dwelled in the land of Goshen, means that they started out in the beginning being in Goshen and experiencing, materially speaking, the good life, where the hardship was in learning Torah. And the fact that the land wasn't theirs meant to say that literally they owned it, but it wasn't holy enough. It wasn't, I shouldn't say holy enough. It didn't have the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore they didn't feel like they belonged there, and therefore they felt pain from being there. They felt sorrow by being there, and that was part of their galus. But first of all, it was still not Eretz Canaan. It was still a Yerida. It was still a descent. Plus, it evolved to the fact that a new generation came around that didn't learn as much Torah and that didn't really feel that pain of not being in Eretz Canaan. And this therefore necessitated that there should be a more literal galus, and the Yidden experienced an actual galus. However, the purpose of this galus was to refine the Yidden and to be able to inherit all of the sparks of Mitzrayim, and therefore Vayigash means they inherited the sparks that were there, or they began the process of inheriting the sparks of holiness that were in Mitzrayim. Now we got to go back to the Rashi we started with, which was the last Rashi, which the first part of Rashi said, the Rashi and the verses the Medrash, where Rashi said that Vayigachazu is Lashon Achuza, which we've been explaining all along, either that it means that he took ownership of it, or in Yena Shel Torah, that where we said one level of Yena Shel Torah means that they lived well, or the other Yena Shel Torah is that they inherited it. Which means that referring to the sparks, and then there's the Medrash that says that that the land took hold of them, and we asked, these are opposites, and we're going to see based on the way we understood the previous Rashi, the way we understood the process of how the Golus Mitzrayim evolved, we'll understand how these two seemingly contrary explanations will fit together. Al Piko and Al is moving their kesher. Zwischen die Beis Pirushim and Vayigash, we'll understand the connection between these two explanations. Leighton Pshat HaKosov is Vayigash and Lashon Achuza. According to the Pshat of the Pasuk, Vayigash means ownership. They own the estate. But in pastors, because Pshat is looking at the literal, the way the eye sees it. And the way the eye sees it at that time, the slavery had not yet begun. At that time, what did it look like? It looked like Eretz Goshen was the ownership, was the estate of the Jewish people, and that was it. Canal, as mentioned at length in the Sikha. But as we said before, the Medrash doesn't look at the surface. The Medrash looks beneath the surface. It looks at the truth of the matter, not just the way it seems to the open eye, but the way it is in its essence. Is Vayigachazu from Lashon Achiza? We have to say Vayigachazu means to take hold, that the land took hold of them and had them in its grasp. But again, they were taken against their will. Vibald as in Toich is the Isyasvus and Eretz Goshen. Give it an inyan for you to deal with time, since in its essence, in its truth, going down to settling in the land of Goshen was actually a step down, away from where they were coming from, which was Eretz Canaan, to go down into Mitzrayim, as Rashi says, Shehi in the previous Rashi, Eretz Mitzrayim, that Goshen was fart, as you say in Yiddish. It was still part of Mitzrayim. And it was actually the opening to which is what made possible the actual shibud, the actual slavery in Mitzrayim. Yishem b'meila the yerida leretz Goshen given behelim ubepnimius in an oifen fun haaretz hoysay chazes b'hem v'tefesas eisam shemakarchei achas ba. Already now, in truth, Eretz Mitzrayim had some sort of grasp on them. Because since this is what was going to play, how it was going to play itself out, what was going to become. So already now, if we look at the truth of the matter, it was the beginning of the end. The Eretz Mitzrayim had a grasp on them, and they were going to be there against their will. They were going to be enslaved to the land of Mitzrayim. But in the next paragraph, the Rebbe is going to say that not only is the comparison, is the connection between these two pirushim, that bechitshonius, it was achuza, and b'pnimius there was achiza, that the land of Mitzrayim took hold of them. There is another connection. Und die pnimistische Kavane und Tam was das muss sein der Linie von Vayigash über leiten Pirus von Medrash as Aretz sei chazas chulu eisam, and the deeper intent and reason why there had to be this experience, that the land should take hold of them and they should be enslaved by it, is Merumas and Yenis Otera was in Pirish Rashi, is hinted in the Yenis Otera of the Rashi. The Mechuvim von Zer Musen Zayin Begolos Mitzrayim, the two Yenis Oteros. One was Achuza, that they lived there comfortably. The other one is Achiza, that Achuza Lashon Yerusha. So now the two connect. That they're mechuvan from their musen zayin begolos Mitzrayim, because the reason why they had to be in the land of Mitzrayim, Kepirush HaMedrash, is ungedait in Lashon Achuza. It is symbolized, it is hinted in the word Achuza. In order for them to be able to inherit all of the good that is in the sparks of Toyu that fell when the world of Toyu, when there was the Shviras HaKelim, when the vessels of Toyu shattered and the sparks fell down into Mitzrayim, the purpose of going into Mitzrayim was so that they should Yodesh, they should inherit all of these sparks. As the Pasuk says, and then they will go out in great wealth, referring to the wealth of the sparks that they gained and they elevated and they took along with them going out of Mitzrayim. So not only are we looking at the connection between the two, that achuz, on the external level they were living it up, lashon achuza, but internally this was the beginning of the actual galus, lashon achiza, the land took hold of them. Also in Yenis Shalteira, the fact that their land took hold of them, that they had to experience a galus, was in order for the achuza lashon Yerusha, that they should be able to inherit the nitzeitzes hakdusha, the sparks of kedusha. So therefore we see the answer to the question. This is the connection between the two pirushim, the pirush of Rashi and the pirush of Medrash, that once you understand the steps of how galus became and the various different intents and purposes that were meant to be, we understand what the two explanations in the words Vayachazuba as brought in Rashi and as brought in the Medrash.